the talk will be split up into 3 parts, 2 parts followed by a brief 10-minute intermission, and then the last part. Again, there's snacks out there, so feel free to grab more at intermission. Additionally, we have this survey that's up here. So at intermission, if you wouldn't mind grabbing this, it's really useful for our speakers to get feedback on their speaking style, as well as us to get some demographic feedback from all of you. And the last thing I'll say is that I know these guys could probably talk about their work all night long. So Katie and I are probably going to act as kind of like the bad cop, trying to hurry things along at times. So if we cut you off for questions at any point, don't be offended. You'll have more time to talk to them during intermission and after the talk. We just need to keep things moving throughout the night. So with that, I'll give it over to Peter and let him get started.
Thanks, guys. Thank you all for coming tonight. Science PhD program at Harvard University. And tonight, along with my colleagues and friends, Becky Fox and Eric Kiva, we'll be talking a little bit about understanding suicide risk. In particular, we're going to be discussing the role of language, emotion, and pain, and how these concepts influence self-harm. So, suicide is kind of a perplexing phenomenon. Perhaps more than any other motivation, humans are driven for self-preservation. Yes, taking one's life is an age-old phenomenon, present across cultures. It's been present for most of recorded history. Despite how long it's been around and how long it's been considered a societal problem, we continue to know very little about suicide and why it occurs. However, research from our group and others like it around the world have recently started to be done using data to help us chip away at this difficult problem. So tonight, we're going to be talking to you about that research with our lab and others like it. But just to give you a quick overview of how it's going to go, I'm going to give an introduction to suicide, a little bit about some terms and demographic variables, and to orient you to some of these concepts that we're going to be discussing for the rest of the evening. Then Catherine talked about emotion regulation and non-suicidal self-injury. And finally, Eric will talk about alternative emotion regulation strategies to self-harm. First, I'd like to introduce Philip. Philip is a 24-year-old man living in a rural area in the northeast United States. 9 months before his death, Philip lost his job at a small manufacturing facility. After that, he felt trapped living in a small town where he grew up. He started to abuse alcohol and not just out at parties with friends, but sometimes also alone to try and make himself feel better. One night in October 2012, after briefly meeting up with some high school friends, he went home alone. He parked his car in his driveway and put his life in his father's job. Philip left behind 2 older brothers. Both of his brothers knew that Philip at times had struggled with depression and even cut himself on occasion while he was growing up. Nonetheless, the news of Philip's death came as a shock. It was an incredible surprise to his brother. But, despite this incredible tragedy of Philip and his story, our lab and the labs like ours around the world are dedicated to understanding this tremendous problem and relieving it for those who suffer from it and those who are impacted by it every single year. And so tonight, what we're going to focus on is the upside of this, the positives, the research that we understand how we're going to prevent this terribly destructive behavior. So first, what I'll talk about is the prevalence and cost of suicide. Then, I'll discuss some suicide demographics, giving a sense of who it is who's at risk for suicide. Next, I'll discuss some definitions and terms that we'll be using throughout the remainder of the talk. Then, I'll introduce you to some of the ways that we study suicide as a scientific discipline in labs like ours. And finally, I'll end with a few questions and answers from you. So what we see here are the top 5 causes of death in the United States today. And if you're willing, I'd like to ask, who thinks that cancer is the #1 cause of death in the United States? Who's right? Okay. Who thinks that it's unintentional injuries, things like accidental drowning, accidental fire alarm discharge, motor vehicle accidents, etc.? Okay? Who thinks it's homicide is the number one killer of people in the United States? What about heart disease? And finally, who thinks suicide is the number one cause of death? So today, suicide is a problem that affects millions of families in America. For those who are ages 10 to 34, it's the second leading cause of death. For those ages 35 to 54, it is the fourth leading cause of death. And of all the deaths, the top 5 causes in the United States, suicide accounts for approximately 13% of these deaths. And as my advisor has noted, this means that someone is more likely to die by his or her own hand than by that of someone else. So, I read this, each year, just over 40,000 Americans die by suicide. To give you a sense of the perspective of this problem, that's more than double the capacity of Boston's TD Garden. In addition to the emotional loss that suicide is associated with, there's also an economic burden. It's falling most heavily on adults of working age. So what this figure shows is the medical and work-related costs of suicide in the United States based on death by intent, including suicide, in the United States in 2013. What we see is that suicide in 2013 accounted for $50.8 billion. And that's about 24% of the total fatal injury costs in the US. So, next, what I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, as I mentioned earlier, is who is at risk for suicide. So, we know that suicide differs in different ethnic groups. What we're seeing here is a graph on the y-axis showing suicide rate for 100,000 people. The blue bars represent 4 separate ethnic groups. We found that about 14.7 deaths per 100,000 due to suicide is that American Indian and Alaskan Native Americans are about the highest ethnic group in terms of suicide. They're followed not far behind by white Americans at 12.6 suicides per 100,000 individuals. We also know that age is a relevant factor in considering suicide rates. What we see here is the same kind of graph, but instead of ethnic group on the x-axis, we're actually looking at age groups. So we see that the rate drastically increases from 10 up through the adolescent years to about 20 to 24. It's the same age that Philip was in the story that I talked about before. After this, suicide rate sort of tapers off a bit, but then continues to rise up until ages 50 to 54, who in America represent the highest physical group that is likely to die by suicide. Next, this graph shows geography-based suicide rates, looking state by state. In darker colors, you see states with higher suicide rates, and in lighter colors, states with lower suicide rates. What this map shows is that Wyoming, Alaska, and Montana are the states with the 3 highest suicide rates in the US, while Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York State are the 3 lowest. Remember I told you, Philip was from a rural area. You see, based on this map, the areas with smaller population densities tend to have higher suicide rates. It's an important factor to consider in terms of suicide rates. We also know that gender is a relevant factor, that suicide is not equal between males and females. On the y-axis here, we're looking at odds ratio, representing the relative likelihood that one would engage in suicidal behavior. What we see is males in blue are about 3.5 times as likely than females in red to take their own life. But interestingly, we also see that females are about 3 times more likely than males to attempt suicide. And in addition, females are also more likely to think about suicide than do that. So with that in mind, the next thing I'd like to jump into is a review of some of the terms that encompass the behaviors that we know to be relevant to suicide research. So, first, and perhaps foremost, most obviously maybe, is suicide death. Suicide death is death caused by direct, self-directed, injurious behavior with the intent to die. Most people, including psychologists, think about suicide or discuss it in their research. This is often what they mean. But we also know that there are other behaviors relevant to suicide and suicide risk. One of these is suicide attempt. Of course, this may be sort of obvious, but suicide attempt is a non-fatal, deliberate, self-directed act with the intent to die as a result. Next is suicide ideation, which includes thoughts about suicide, killing oneself. And finally, non-suicidal self-injury. They're self-directed, injurious acts with no intent to die as a result. This includes things like cutting or burning oneself. And for reference, these will be some of the topics discussed by Catherine, in particular, also Eric, in the presentations that follow along. But together, these behaviors are termed self-injurious thoughts and behaviors, and they represent the #1 risk factor for suicide. And so it should be obvious that these are the things we should be focusing on. What we want to do is gain some predictive power to better predict suicide in the real world. So next, we'll talk a little bit about is how our lab and others study suicide. And just to remind you, I already told you a little bit about who is at risk for suicide, but why would people engage in self-injurious behavior intentionally? It's a tricky question, and it's one that's perplexed researchers for decades, as I mentioned. But recent advances in the ways that we study suicide have started to shed some light about why people might engage in this. So tonight, right now, I'll show you some of the ways that we do this in our lab. Well, first, I think it's important to mention, for decades, the primary way we study suicide is through self-report. And self-report would be reporting by yourself to a researcher about your own engagement behavior, either in the past or present, but also reporting on your own estimation of your future likelihood to continue engaging in these kinds of behaviors. And to be clear, self-report has provided a ton of clarity in terms of better understanding suicide and suicide risk. But there are some newer methods, in particular ones that we've been using in our lab, that when combined with self-report, have shown incredibly powerful results for indicating suicide risk through things like suicidal thinking. So first, what I'd like to show you is a task that we developed in our lab at Harvard to measure suicidal thinking. If you're willing, I'd love to try this together. What you're going to see is a small cross appear on the middle of the screen. This is just to focus your attention in the middle so you're ready for what's coming up. After that, you're going to see a word. If you're willing, what I'd like you to do is simply shout out the color of that word. It will either be red or blue. You ready? Oh, I'm sorry, this is super tricky. Well, so what I showed, what I just showed, or I tried to show, I'm sorry for the problem on this hack, really is that you would see a word and then you shout the color of it, and then move on to another word, and you go through a series of words like this. But importantly, the words, so that last very brief slide, the words that I showed you were based in 2 separate categories. Half of the words were suicidal in nature, and the other half were negative, but non-suicidal. And so this is important, because what we're doing is comparing the response time between one type of word and the other. In this context, response time indicates the amount of interference the meaning of that word holds on your thoughts. So greater response time indicates greater interference. This This is important because it allows us to make some predictions about what types of people might score differently on this test. So what I'd like to do is next is simply show you the results from this experiment. And just to backtrack and give you a sense for how this experiment came about, the researchers from our lab, Dr. Steve Chan and Dr. Matthew Knott, went to a psychiatric inpatient unit here in the Boston area. They asked people who were in the inpatient unit if they would answer some questions and complete a brief task. Importantly, about half of these individuals were in this inpatient unit because they had made suicide. The other half had not. What I'll show you is the data of these two groups based on the different types of words and their response delay for them. So first, what we see is that for negative words, the attempters in green are much higher than the non-attempters in blue, meaning they got caught up in the meaning of these negative, non-suicide related words. I guess that's not surprising. But this next result, I think, is particularly interesting. We're seeing a gigantic difference in terms of the response time between suicide attempters and non-suicide attempters for suicide-related words, indicating quite clearly that these individuals may be getting especially trapped or caught up in the meaning of suicide-related words, with this difference between those attempters and those who are non-attempters. On its own, these results are interesting, but they don't actually reveal all that much about real-world suicidal behavior. But the researchers of this who wrote this study followed up every single individual who was part of the original research project 6 months later. Sadly, during that 6-month window, some portion of these individuals did go on to make a suicide attempt. But it turns out that delay, we can measure using the task that I just showed you, predicted who it was among this group who would go on to then make a suicide attempt. But importantly, this predictability exceeded that of other common clinical measures that we would use typically to assess an individual's risk of engaging in suicidal behavior, including suicide attempts. And this includes depression scores from the individuals, the report by the emergency room physician of how likely he thought that individual was to go on to make a suicide attempt. You've seen this concept already. The results based on that task also predicted whether someone would go on to make a suicide attempt above and beyond that individual's own self-report of their risk. So what we're seeing here is a very simple behavioral task. It's easy to employ in a number of settings, including the emergency room. It's capable of identifying real-world suicide risk over a relatively long period. And the truth is, this is the kind of thing that's been lacking in suicide research and suicide prevention for decades. So it's a really an exciting advance in terms of our scientific ability to get some traction on this behavior and start preventing it. So, in summary, what I talked about tonight was a little bit of the cost, both emotionally and financially, of suicide in America. I also discussed demographic risk factors, so you can see who it is who's most at risk for suicide. Then I outlined several self-injurious thoughts and behaviors, giving you definitions, and maybe hopefully giving you some clarity about these terms that are relevant to real suicide risk. I also talked about the science of suicide. We actually a great preview of some interesting and powerful results that our lab found a few years ago, looking at how to prevent the suicide problem in a serious way. So next up, we're going to have a discussion about emotion regulation, why that is relevant to some of these topics, especially non-suicidal self-injury. But before we switch over, I would love to pause, thank you, and take any questions you may have.
Suicide
So the question is, you messed up on some of the slides, and you missed the words that I wanted to present to you. I'm sorry about that. But what were the differences between these words, and why is that important for the study of suicide? So the words that we were looking at were words with negative content. These are things like scared or shame. So intensely emotion-related words that have a seriously negative connotation for the individual. The other words were death and suicide. And so the reason we chose those negative words in the comparison group is to try to take into account the negative content of the suicide-related words. So imagine if the control words were computer or chair. When we compare the reaction time to those words relative to suicide words, we would expect that everyone would show a delay in suicide words. This would differentiate almost nothing in terms of groups and suicide risk. But when we control for the negative connotation, the negative meaning in these words, then we can start to get a little bit of that. What's unique about suicide words in terms of their meaning to specific individuals? So the question is whether this test is readily used by schools or other institutions to track suicide risk. It's not. And it's a great question, though. We'd love to be able to employ this kind of test to say, this person is especially highly risk, we should be hospitalized, and we should take care of this person, we should intervene in some way. The problem is that despite the amount of risk that we know based on general risk factors, and combined with general risk factors, with the predictability of this test, ultimately, the best prediction about any given individual's suicide likelihood is that they won't do it. And the reason for this is that it's an incredibly low base rate behavior. Remember back to the demographic slides that I showed at the beginning. These slides were looking at percent, but not per 100, but per 100,000. We're looking at a very different scale in terms of behavior. And so unfortunately, using this test to predict an individual's suicide risk is not particularly accurate. However, it can differentiate groups of people by taking into account averages. These historical programs. At present, no schools are doing this actively with individuals that we know of. As I did mention, it is a readily employable task, although it might present some problems, I think, for schools and people using it. The results, although important and somewhat accurate, are still pretty very low basis. Sure, so this is a great question. The question is that earlier we saw that there are gender differences between males and females with suicide risk. But I mentioned males are more likely to die by suicide, while females are more likely to attempt suicide. We do have some data that I think can shed some light in terms of answering this question. Overall, we know that suicide method differs between the genders. Here what we're seeing is suicide methods broken up by different colors. On top we have other, which includes a broad category of behaviors, suffocation in light blue, poisoning in dark blue, and then at the bottom firearm use. And then what we see here are percent of females and percent of males engaging in each of those types of behaviors. So what we see here is that by far the most likely method of suicide for females is poisoning, while the most likely method for males is firearm use. And if you think about that, if you think about the lethality of these methods, using a gun is a far more lethal means of achieving suicide than would something like using pills. Pills allow for the option for intervention, that if you take a bunch of pills to end your life, there may still some time to intervene in one way or another, ambulance, for example. But after someone who's used a gun and used himself, it's more difficult to intervene, and that results in far more deaths overall.
Does suicide always start with suicidal ideation and thoughts?
It's an important question, and it's something that people in our field debate about constantly. So, I'm sorry, the question is, With suicide, the act of a suicide attempt or another type of suicidal behavior isn't always preceded by suicide ideation, thoughts of suicide. So some might argue that it's hard to engage in any type of deliberate act without in some sense thinking about it beforehand. However, many argue that there are such a thing as impulsive suicides. So it's something that's sort of up for debate, but a really relevant construct for us to consider. There are individuals who really are thinking about it before they act. There's some people do it without thinking at all. We argue this for both options. One more.
How to cover the financial impact of this?
Sure. I didn't. The CDC looked at the question that was asked is about calculating the financial cost of suicide based on the graph that I showed very early in my presentation. The answer is, what they are looking at are a number of factors. One big one is number of years lost. So if we consider an individual's across our population, average life expectancy, and then look at the age at which an individual dies by suicide, we can factor in what the amount of money contributed to their own life and society we lose by virtue of not having that individual workforce. But there are other metrics that are important too. One big one is the fact that ambulances, medical staff, etc., these cost a considerable amount of money. When we consider the fact that 40,000 plus individuals are engaging in behavior annually, then those kinds of care-related costs also come into play. Thank you very much. I appreciate your listening.
So he told me that non-suicidal behavior is without non-suicidal. And I just want to make sure we're all on the same page on what we're talking about here. So non-suicidal self-injury is considered moderate. It includes things like cutting your skin or hitting your skin and bruise, those types of behaviors that do have a lasting effect. It doesn't include things like picking at wounds, biting at skin or nails, or those types of things that we see much more commonly. And it also doesn't include social sanction behaviors like tattooing, for example. So what I just surprised to know, or at least I was surprised to learn that non-suicidal self-injury is really quite prevalent in the United States. About 5.5% adults and 17% of teens report engaging in behaviors. Among people seeking intensive psychiatric care, these numbers are even higher, potentially reaching 50%. In addition to being dangerous on their own, non-suicidal behaviors are associated with numerous negative outcomes, most notably future suicide. And so during the talk today, I want to focus on two things. First, I want to talk about why non-suicidal self-injury might be related to suicide. And next, I want to talk about how people engage in non-suicidal self-injury. one of the most common of these is that there might be things increasing the risk for both of these different types of behaviors. So if you think back to Philip, you know that growing up he had been depressed, and later he went on to have himself, and later to take. So it could be things that mental illnesses like those with CP predispose people to both of these types of behaviors. And consistent with that idea, the majority of people who do engage in self-engaged behaviors do have this. But what's tricky here is that the majority of people with mental illness and even severe mental illness never go on to engage in active self-engagement. So it's probably not the whole story. They're likely other things. And one of the possible things that could be going on is that some people are just born with an inherently lower fear of things like pain, blood, knives, and razors. So in the case of course, you can imagine that in the case of distress, when you heard about the possibility of using non-suicidal self-engagement, it would be easier for him who's less fearful of knives and blood than for someone who's very fearful. Similarly, it might be easier for somebody who's less fearful of the idea of dying. However, what I haven't yet told you is that non-suicidal self-engagement concepts are before suicide for about 13 years, which is 4 or 5 years before most people start engaging. So another possibility is that non-suicidal self-engagement actually acts as a bridge for engaging in suicide. And to make this more clear, it could be that choosing to self-harm or choosing to harm himself would have habituated him to things like pain, blood, and even the idea of things like these. When I say habituated, it means that he becomes less fearful because he now has experience with it and probably. Another possibility that I find particularly interesting is the possibility of some amount of conditioning. And just in case you guys aren't familiar with cognitive conditioning, I want to give it a brief time. So imagine somebody says they're going to get you your day. Their name right now is called ice cream. As soon as the ice cream is put in front of me, we're just talking about examples. And it is that I'm really into salad as I think about eating ice cream. Now imagine the next 100 times my first minute of development, and then I was given a ice cream. So over and over again, I hear Bell, think of ice cream salad. Bell, ice cream salad. Eventually, just the bell on its own would lead me to salad. Because now I'm going to associate that bell with it. That makes sense to you? Okay. So you're probably wondering why this might be related to non-suicidal self-engagement. And what we know from a lot of research is that the majority of people who engage in suicide say that doing so actually helps them feel better, helps them to regulate their emotions. And so you can imagine that to engage in non-suicidal self-engagement. In fact, even research from my study has told me that self-harm is almost like an addiction for them, and they have really high response. One person said he didn't know me. I have a strong urge, a desire, and a love to use that. The feeling I get is such a relief and better than almost anything else. So now bringing this back to probability of conditioning. You know that to engage in non-suicidal self-engagement, you would have to expose yourself to things like knives, razors, blood, even exposing yourself to the idea of yourself as somebody who's and if you're repeatedly paranoid but feeling better, over time all of those things on their own will start to be associated with feeling better as well. So maybe over time people are becoming less fearful of these types of things because of this conditioning process that's going on, which then actually exposes them to choose kind of that themselves in the life in the future to be their less fearful of those things, or even feel more positive about those things. So what I'm hoping you're all gathering now is why non-suicidal self-engagement can make people feel. And to most of you here, I guess is that sounds very counterintuitive. Most of us try to avoid pain at all costs, and probably pain from that choosing things. And so that's what I want to focus on next. Why do people engage in non-suicidal self-engagement? Which I think can be better understood in terms of the question, why is non-suicidal self-engagement important? And I'm specifically going to be focusing on 3 different models that explain why non-suicidal self-engagement. And those are pain offset relief, distraction, and self-harm. So first to tell you a little bit about pain offset relief. This is specifically referring to when pain relieves. So once again, in skin, large body of research across people who do and don't engage in non-suicidal self-care. It shows that we all feel better as we're in the world. And you might be looking for some evolutionary reasons why that is. What I find particularly interesting is that if you can see this in other species, we can talk about the different ways we can see this. So you know that pain offset relief makes people feel better, so relief will. But there are two other models as well that kind of focus on that during pain. What about pain? Help people feel better. And one of those is the idea of distraction. So people can working on suicide have very negative emotions. And it could be that choosing hot or helps take their attention away from those emotions and towards something else. You can really that. So for example, when you're recording a talk today, you can do coffee, talking to the house, and the dog that walked into the room, that lady would help him shift his thoughts from being in his head and helping himself to distract the dog. And you can do just by focusing attention. But the issue with non-suicidal self-injury, where it might be different, is that people engaging in these behaviors tend to have more negative emotions than people. And the negative moods are sort of it's a little bit stickier. So people who propose the distraction model say, hey, this people distracted, probably won't know. Meaning, it's really close to distracted is necessary for people who are engaging in this. And the last model we're going to talk about is the self-punishment model. And rather than focusing on negative mood more generally, this focuses specifically on self-criticism. And I'm bringing self-criticism into the picture because there's a lot of research on being non-suicidal self-injury. For example, people who engage in non-suicidal self-injury can have higher levels of self-criticism than other people. And we also see that self-criticism actually predicts how long somebody will live using psychological. Finally, there's some research to suggest that self-criticism actually predicts future. So together, this paints a picture of why we're not focusing on self-criticism. And the self-punishment model brings in the fact that the majority of people who are highly self-critical and engaging in non-suicidal self-injury see that they do it in part to improve their mood and in part to self-harm. So the idea here is that maybe for highly self-critical people, the pain that they're feeling itself is deserved and not that it helps them. So what I'm going to talk about now is a research study that we did in my lab that tried to look at each of these different models as ways that people can engage in non-suicidal self-injury. And the main question we're asking is what do we do? And before we did the study, we had a few different thoughts. First, we thought that non-painful distraction would result in small changes in mood. And this is a little bit different from what some of the researchers hypothesized that model would say. But we've seen that distraction can work with other disciplines and illnesses. We thought it might work here as well. We also thought that pain would improve mood for all of instance, and that this change would be associated with self-criticism. In other words, we thought that people would feel better during pain, and the more self-critical instances were, the better they would feel. And so, to test these questions, we did a few things. First, we brought just about 100 people who engaged in non-suicidal self-injury in the past year into our lab, and we tried to put them in a bad mood by using what we call negative mood. And the reason we did this is because we know that talking to people that are not engaging in these behaviors when they're feeling good, breathing deeper, they're engaging in behaviors when they're feeling. So that was it. After that, we had all participants do one of three tasks. They either did a distraction task, a pain task, or a time task. And I'll tell you a little bit about it. So for our distraction task, we had all participants listen to a whole set of neutral words. And these are words that have been rated as neutral and have them write down these words as they were listening to them, either in all uppercase letters, all lowercase letters, or a mix of other letters. And the goal of this distraction wasn't to induce positivity necessarily, it was like just to activate it. And that's why we were also able to other participants did a pain task using what we call a threshold barometer and their phone right. So as you can see from the picture, we asked participants to put the point of the odometer and you can use the necklace on the as soon as you place the odometer on the finger, you'll immediately feel pressure, and over time the pressure starts to build. So we asked our participants to tell us when they felt pain, and then they can choose to terminate the task whenever they want to. Finally, the remaining distance, they would be called a time pass, in which they just sat in the room for the same amount of time as the other students. And it's just like sound. But regardless of condition, regardless of the task they're completing, all of the groups rate their reading before, during, and after. Because really, we really want to know how each of these tasks would be affected. So, looking at the results, this is a graph on the y-axis plotting their negative mood. And this would be an average rating of negative mood, either pre-class, during class, or post-class. So what we found was that the distraction condition did result in significant reductions in and all of these were completely impacted. However, neither the time nor the impact resulted in changes. So what I'm showing you so far is that distraction did result in small changes in mood, which is what we thought would happen. But pain didn't. And again, that's different from what we thought, which brings us to the second part of that second point. So we thought that changes in mood during pain would be associated with levels of self-criticism. So now I'm going to show you a pretty similar graph. Except this time we split participants into those who self-reported high and low self-criticism. So what we found is that among those reporting low levels of self-criticism, participants got worse during pain and better after they were removed. So this is supporting that pain also may be feeling better once the pain is removed, but people will get worse during pain. In contrast, participants high in self-criticism actually reported feeling better during pain and about the same after removal. So in contrast to those with low self-criticism, who showed more of a pain also removed benefit, people high in self-criticism appear to be improving through the experience of pain itself, which might be supporting that self-punishment model that I talked about. So during the talk today, I first discussed reasons why non-suicidal self-injury may be related to suicide, focusing both on the fact that mental illness tends to be higher in behaviors and on the possibility of conditioning. Second, I talked about why people engage in non-suicidal self-injury, specifically focusing on 3 models that explain why non-suicidal self-injury might happen. Thank you. And so next I'll take some questions. And then So the question of whether or not there might be a hormonal component of why people would feel better after engaging in non-suicidal self-injury. Is that right? Yeah. And so for a long time, people did think that that was the case. There are hypotheses about opioids and things like that that have actually looked into the literature. It doesn't seem to be fully supported at this point. So there might be a hormonal component, but it's not entirely clear.
Do you think people are less likely to commit suicide if you tell somebody that the things that bother you or that you think
So the question is whether or not somebody might be less likely to develop suicide if they talk to somebody about things bothering them than if they do suicide. And I'm not sure if there is reason.
Don't they have guidance counselors in high school?
So they do, yeah.
Don't
So
they have guidance counselors in high school to talk to kids about their problems?
they definitely are. And the idea is that potentially social support, so even having somebody you could talk to is thought to be protective, and it might help decrease the likelihood that somebody will die by suicide. But to be honest, they are really, really limited. So I want to point out what you said before. Statistical methods are not great at predicting the role of certain behaviors, especially when it comes to protective factors like that. There's not compute. So the question was whether or not there are some prevention methods that we could be employing earlier on, given that some amount of conditioning might be happening that predispose people to both non-suicidal and suicidal. And that's what a lot of the research that I've gone through over the past few years has been. So it's specifically a treatment that tends to make people call non-suicidal self-injury, which we don't necessarily consider compulsive. There do seem to be some differences in that compulsive behaviors are often done repeatedly, even if it's sitting, aren't necessarily as painful, and don't always turn into non-suicidal self-injury, and vice versa. So we tend to think of them as different, as a battery traits like a different thing that are associated with that different. But they do have some things about them that
So in some cases, as students, I can study showing that they're not suicidal, self-harm, self-criticism, distraction, and upset. All these deeper factors, or is it always one?
do you want to ask people what their perception of those, or do you?
Or no, like just like the cause of suicide.
So the question was, what causes people to engage in non-suicidal self-injury, whether it's distractions or things like grief or something.
If all three can be
Or all three can be good. I think that's a great. So this was one of the first things to actually look at self-punishment and distraction in this population. And I think it's highly likely that these things are working together in interesting ways. That's why I think that last graph in the show. At different times when somebody's feeling more self-critical, they might get more versus later on if they were starting to feel better, they might get more and then all these it could be something to distract. I don't think it's just distraction alone, it's really something that people have to happen. I was just thinking about my husband about the same thing going on that. So, when the over that. The question is, how much dissociation and control are related to people engaging in non-suicidal self-injury. And if you talk to people about behaviors, many people report that they often use self-petting or things like that when they're dissociated to bring them back into the moment. But if you really describe what dissociating, so dissociation would be kind of like an out of your mind, out of body experience, where like you're not in the moment, you're zooming out, looking at yourself from further perspective, or there are people who do that. So self-harm could serve as a way to bring you back into it. But in terms of research on that, it's super limited because we can't actually bring towards the lab and have them harm the lab. And most people aren't associated when they're in the lab for that reason. So empirical evidence about that is very limited. That's a really interesting problem that we should try out. That's a great question. So there are a few different ways to do it. In this study, we used self-report. The question was how we measured mood improvement in this study. So in this study, we did use self-report, both negative and positive mood. But you can also use what's called psychophysiological. Maybe you can look at different movements in the face or but for me to be, there are other ways to do it as well. Sorry. But yeah, there are other ways to do it.
Okay, we're gonna have a 10-minute intermission right now. Again, please feel free to pick up a survey and then we'll come back to the last part.
So there's no kind of report of that. Like a skin box.
I actually never interacted with them. That was definitely awesome. They're all four. Oh, actually, been meaning to talk to Jordan and see if she'll read CRISPR DNA. It's like not that. I was possibly was going to have the graphic design together with a special edition that's just here. I was like, I'm still looking at things to not think about. So I wanted to think about that just has that. Yeah, or like whenever the election decided to be like, and so like, now it's election over. I think I become numb to it, but I'm not scared. And I'm not excited. I'm just kind of like, yeah. I think I just become numb. Yeah. Yeah, we were talking. I think Troy might have this on Tuesday. We're like, we should all just my friend Jess is already like, I'm not going to like, I'm just going to block out. Oh my god. I can figure it out. I'm sorry. But I think it's not a good spot. I mean, things are going fine, but I just feel like I just have like well, I'm going home this. Yeah, that would be nice. I think it's just that we have all to get here, and then all of this on top of the lab work. like it doesn't really hit me.
Yeah, with my jacket and my radio.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, so just okay. Usually, have the full recording, so they'll be with the live stream up right away. We'll have a better
Yeah, so you'll be able to see all of it. The report is good.
Then, I think we'll need to change the battery on the camera one. Yeah. Okay. I think that's what we're doing. We have two more.
There it is.
Got it.
They do exist. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Hopefully you all have a chance to grab some snacks and use the restroom. So we're going to get started on the final part of our lecture. I just want to put in one final plug for our surveys as well as our flyers for the student events. If you have purchased your plan already, please grab one. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for being here. I'm very interested in how that you can as well as some collaborative plans. So, my job for tonight is to kind of do a little bit of story lining, a little bit of hope, with the kind of ways that we're thinking about how potential what people do in their lives or bigger interventions to conflict behaviors. But before we jump into what I'm going to discuss, let me just refresh your memory of how people are in. So first of all, this is the idea that suicide and non-suicidal are personal and that attacking these people is a solution to scientists across the world. We also heard that non-suicidal psychiatry is pervasive and this path to these two things relate to each other before applying that to the problem of suicide. And finally, I'll wrap up by saying this in relation. But let's start with this concept. So, can you tell me, children, who here has ever been to a therapist? Okay, that's excellent. So you're really excited for that. So if you have ever seen a therapist or talked with a friend after a negative incident in your life, you probably experienced cognitive behavioral disorder. Basically, cognitive behavioral disorder is a therapeutic skill to help people feel better about having something or regulate their emotions. And in layman's terms, cognitive behavioral disorder is just doing something you used to do so you feel better about cognition, referencing refers to your thoughts. And reappraisal is the meaning of something, and reappraisal is changing the meaning of that. So cognitive reappraisal is rethinking the meaning of the situation and feel better about it. Just to make this crystal clear, I'm just tell you about my friend Bob. So Bob is very excited to have a fun with his friends this weekend. And so obviously when he comes out of the plane, Bob can see this. Fortunately, this is an excellent opportunity for Bob to go through this process of cognitive behavioral. You might think, actually, I recently bought a brand new tea kettle and I'm so excited to share with my friends. And instead, I'll just invite them over and we'll have a tea together. And maybe that will make Bob feel better. So the same situation is happening in the world, but Bob changes what the situation means to him in order to regulate his emotions. This is something that therapists are in their patients do all the time. But what's really interesting is that there are many different ways you can go about reappraising these situations. And one that has been studied quite thoroughly is this idea of psychological distancing. In essence, people feel better about things when they're simply far away from them. But there's something interesting about psychological distance and how our mind represents distances in different domains. So let me explain what I mean by that. There's representation of a person, and things that are close to this person are in darker circles, and things that are far away are in lighter circles. And what's fascinating is that the mind collapses 3 different domains of distance onto a common neural and linguistic code. We even use the words close and far to describe distance on all 3 of these domains. For instance, the physical domain, the social domain, and the temporal domain. So to make this clear, we'd say that Boston is closer than Bangkok because they differ in physical difference from here, where we're sitting right now. We also say that our best friends are closer to us than our baristas. We use the same language and in fact the same neural region computes differences on social domain of distance as we do for our physical domain of distance. And similarly, we say that tomorrow feels closer than December. So what's so amazing about the idea that our mind collapses these 3 domains onto a common code is that we can actually help people feel better about things by imagining them as far away on any of these domains. People feel better when things are happening farther away from them in space, in social perspective, or even a long time. So let me spell this out for you as well. Let's come back to Bob. And let's say Bob not only has a penchant for cozy time with his friends at home, but he also has an extreme spider phobia. Okay, so when Bob sees a spider like this really close to him, he gets scared. But what an excellent strategy that Bob can use is something that people have studied before, is that when Bob is thinking about interacting with spiders, he'll feel better about this spider if he just imagines it as happening far away from him. Physically, if he imagines it as physically farther away, he feels better than if it's physically close to him. Similarly, Bob might feel very frightened if he imagines a spider head on, looking at it through his own eyes. And interestingly, a strategy Bob can use to feel better about spiders is just to imagine this interaction from a third-person perspective. If he reflects on interacting with a spider, viewing himself in the room as a third-person observer, we know, both in terms of his self-report and also some of these psychophysiological reactions that Catherine was talking about, his skin conductance, heart rate, even amygdala reactivity to this situation, will decrease if he sees it from a third-person perspective. So social distancing can help Bob feel better about his interaction. And finally, it should be fairly obvious that if we reflect on something happening right here, right now, Bob interacting with the spider in the room at the present moment, that's going to make him a lot more terrified than if he thinks about some situation that happened months or even years ago. So what I'm trying to explain right now is the idea that cognitive reappraisal is a strategy of thinking differently about things around you to make yourself feel better about it. And one strategy that we've studied is simply moving things away from you in space, time, and social distance. But now I'm going to tell you about a really curious phenomenon called linguistic distance. So a number of researchers have begun to study how the words that people are using in their thoughts, in their speech, and in their written text are at any given moment capable of demonstrating whether someone is paying attention to what's going on right here and right now versus distancing away from what is going on right here and right now. How might we do that? Well, if we return to this concept of three different domains of psychological distance, we'll see that for two of these, there are grammatical categories that actually track distance along those domains. For instance, our use of first-person singular pronouns, it's like I, you, mine, and mine, track a greater focus on the closest social target, namely yourself. So people who are using these words more are very focused on themselves, at very low social distancing. And if you eradicate these words from what you are saying and thinking and writing, you're actually forced to move away from yourself, therefore increasing your social distance. Likewise, verb tenses give us a hint as to whether people are talking about what's happening in the closest temporal target, maybe the present moment, versus using present tense verbs, versus using past or future tense verbs, which means that people are distancing away from the temporal present. And what's curious is that people at text in any given moment, analyze what someone is thinking, writing, or saying, and there's a positive correlation between the extent to which people are using first-person singular pronouns and their use of present tense verbs. And this gave rise to the concept of linguistic distancing. People who are using both of these grammatical structures more are very locked into the here and now. And people who are using them less are distancing away. And just to make this crystal clear, let me give you an example of something Bob might have told me in one of our sessions. So Bob said, I can't stand this huge spider sitting on the table right in front of me. Its hairy legs look so gross. I really hope it doesn't jump on me. I bet it's going to hurt me. Now let me show you how this is a low distance comment that Bob just gave me. If I color code his first person singular pronouns in blue and his present tense verb in green, you'll see that there's a lot of these grammatical constructs that track a low psychological distance focus. But if I encourage Bob to rephrase this statement and increase the psychological distance, he might do an excellent job instead of sense. The huge spider sat on the table. Its hairy legs looked so gross. It may have been able to jump. Its poison may have been dangerous. He thinks that this comment is a little less emotionally heated than the others. So what Bob has successfully done is eradicate any use of first-person singular pronouns and transform his use of present tense verbs into past tense verbs. And as you all seem to ascertain, not only does this increase the psychological distance, it also seems to make it seem like he is a little bit less negatively impacted. And this is a perfect segue into the next section that I want to talk to you about, which is how cognitive behavioral, our ability to change what things mean to feel better about them, and psycholinguistic distancing might be intimidating. So, just to make this clear, the question that I have in the next few studies that I'm going to talk to you about is, but shifting our language so that we move away from the grammar opposite. There are two ways that this could happen. The first is that merely distancing your language will in and of itself reduce negative affect. Just distancing your language might regulate your emotions. So how could I test this as a researcher? Well, what we did is we asked people to look at negative images and simply write about them. And then after each image, after writing about each image for 30 seconds, we ask them to rate how bad they found about each image. But what's critical is we manipulated to change how people were writing about these images across participants. So for one group of participants, they saw negative images, and for half of them, they wrote about their picture as if it was happening very physically close to them when they saw the word fear. For the other half, they wrote about it as if it was happening physically far away from them when they saw the word fear. Those are our physical distancing effects. Another group of participants, we had distance socially. For half of them, we told them, use the word I when you write about this picture. For the other half, we told them, don't use the word I when you write about this picture. That was the only instruction that they got. We told them to stop using the first person singular pronoun for I. And our idea was that this would force them to distance away from again the social itself, with increasing distance. And finally, for the third group, we asked them to write about half the pictures using passive tense verbs, but the other half stop using passive tense verbs. And our thought here is that when people are forced to stop using passive tense verbs and increase the use of passive future tense verbs, we'll distance away and our hypothesis was that people would feel better when they did any of these three kinds of things. So here I'm going to show you our results. Dark bars are averages for trials when people are writing using close standard, and lighter bars are trials when people are using a distance standard. Let me first talk to you about physical distancing. So we thought that the participants who were writing about things in close standard group works, and people writing about things physically far away, and that's what we found. People were performing better. That's amazing. And we simply write about second, we thought that the same pattern would happen when we later told people to stop using their mind. Let's say we made it easy. And fascinatingly, that's what we thought. And finally, we thought we might have a similar result when we asked people merely to stop using present tense verbs and writing about the images. And once again, we found the result. So these data from this study seem to suggest that merely shifting the words you use when you're talking about negative experiences, shifting them specifically so that you distance your experience from the way you can now, can make you feel better. For a first hypothesis that's supported, it seems that distancing the message helps you feel better. But there might be a bidirectional relationship between these two concepts. It might also be the case that when we as therapists tell people, change how this makes you feel, change how this makes you feel, people spontaneously distance away from that experience in order to better reimagine and reconstruct and reappraise what this situation means. We ask people to write about it again, but now, instead of asking them to write and observing how they regulate, we tell them to regulate. So for half of the images, we tell them just respond naturally to this image, like whatever comes to mind. And for the other half, we ask them to reinterpret the image to make themselves feel better about it. So for instance, for this condition, say, oh, I see some plastic bugs on the inside, I feel fine about this, and still actually. And that's a reappraisal of the image rather than saying this is a disgusting image that on the screen. And as a manipulation check, just to make sure that we were giving clear data, we wanted to first observe that people felt better after they had regulated their emotions. And that's indeed what we found. People reported feeling worse about images when they were supposed to respond naturally and better when they had to change their mood. But what we were really interested in was whether asking people to change their emotions, might also change the language that they're using as they're going through this process. So here I'm going to present to you a composite measure, something that incorporates both how much people are using first-person singular pronouns and present verbs. And I'll explain how these actually work. If you see lower bars, that means that people have less distance. They're using more I and more long. You see higher bars, that means that people are using their distance away, using less first-person pronouns and less verbs. New counts exactly what we would expect. People who are regulating their getting some distance away from it can help you do that. To summarize this, let me give you another example. The clause in this situation where he's reflecting on how morose he is about his upcoming ruin, he might reinterpret the situation better if rather than saying, I am so dismayed about this terrible thing that's happened to me, if he gets some distance and says to himself, oh, that's going as unexpected, he might actually be even better at coming up with an alternate. Now that we've described some of the work that I've done with Swagger and Bolsonaro, I wanted to tell you about the timing study where we connect the work that we've been doing on basic language manipulation to how we are talking about suicide and non-suicidal. And the question here is, could linguistic distancing help people regulate negative emotion without the need for self-injury or suicide? As both people have discussed, potentially self-injury and suicidal ideation are tools that people use in order to help them feel better about their emotions. But maybe we can help people achieve that result in a way. And to get an initial exploration into whether this might indeed be possible, we wanted to assess the language that people use when they're talking about suicide and suicidal ideation. Now, as we discussed, it's very difficult to study people who are acutely suicidal. But fortunately, there's this wonderful place where you can observe people doing all sorts of things, including talking. So, this is a project that we had, and I was fortunate and our collaborative Stroop is we went onto a website called teamtalk.org, and we scraped the text that people were using to communicate. And this website is a place where teenagers and adults will want to discuss a number of things that they are struggling with, including thoughts of ending their lives, non-suicidal self-injury, and other stressors that they're experiencing. And as you can see, we took like almost 16,000 posts with a large data set to see whether there's a relationship between and we use a technique called machine learning method, which basically uses a series of algorithms to detect whether certain words tend to appear with each other with certain amounts of consistency so that we can split the posts, these 16,000 posts, into 3 different groups without us needing to go through line by line and constantly. And this is a collaboration with the and very successfully, we were able to split these 16,000 posts into 3 different groups. One group in which people are discussing suicide and wanting to end their life. Another group of posts in which people are talking about non-suicidal self-injury, but in response to outcomes. And the third group, which we included as a control, is something that we wanted a group where posts where people are talking about things that are very stressful and difficult, but not related to suicide. And these are people talking about conflict with family. So we analyzed these posts, just as I did in my other studies, to compute how much people are using language that is distanced away from here and now, which is very often. And I'm going to present this on the same axis I did before, comparing these more distance. First of all, let me show you the difference between people who are talking about suicide versus people who are talking about this negative thing. And this is where our hypothesis is explored. People are much more locked into their account than they do the same thing in their life. This would suggest that people who are experiencing suicide are so locked into their own experiences that they're having a difficult time reappraising what's going on around them, potentially helping people in this state to gain some distance to their words and thoughts and help them better regulate that they don't feel most of them by some of the it's potentially these people are distance already because they engaged in a rationalization strategy that is successful for them. So these people are in need of that sort of engagement to help them gain some of this experience because they've already undergone this. However, nonetheless, this project provides additional evidence that in this system might be helpful in circumventing the use of the emotional strategies in the system evaluation. So we told you a lot tonight, and I wanted to give you just a high-level bullet points of what each of us mentioned, so you know it. First of all, suicide and self-injury are immense problems that require creative scientific solutions. Catherine's work shows that non-suicidal self-injury might help regulate emotions. My work shows that we can do better at regulating our emotions if we use more responsive language. Research shows that people who are talking about suicide are very low risk, and people who are talking about self-injury. And all of us are using these insights to continue to study phenomena and work towards widespread awareness that we can suicide. With that, I'd like to thank the large number of people who have contributed to our project. We've discussed a number of studies and all the co-authors on this project. We'd also like to thank the masters for us and for presentations and our presenters. And lastly, we all agree that I would not be considered amazing team of research systems helping my research. I would thank you for being here.
Have you looked at linguistic distancing and how it differs in other languages and our language?
It's an excellent question. So the question is about whether linguistic distancing also exists in languages. This is a question that I would and I wish that I could direct you to excellent research on it. They haven't been good. And I think that's mostly because linguistic distancing is a very new construct in the field. There is some research on how language in general shapes our thoughts and behaviors. It's a large debate, and I think it depends a lot on what kind of psychological process you're talking about. For some, potentially there's very little influence in language. For some, there's potentially very large influence in language. But in general, concepts of time and the words that we use for time are actually related to some very interesting ideas. One interesting German, for instance, and I don't speak German, but the people influencing that there is less of a division between present and future in German compared to English. And also, there's a correlation between German and the ability to plan more into the future. So you can look into the future, such as your bank account, your savings account size, and how willing you are to sacrifice a small reward that you get right now in order to get a bigger reward later on. So in that way, there is a relationship between the language that we speak and the approach to temporal related phenomena. But how does that relate to distancing? That has not been said. My prediction is that if you can find a way for people to distance using words, regardless of the language, you would get applications that you can do that. But that's a totally imperfect question.
It seems clear that a lot of work has been done to try to figure out how to help people who are hurting, feeling, is there something toward research that you tell us whether that is how the research are putting the suicide threatening?
This is an excellent question that I would love anyone to know about this. We do know that there are genetic contributors to some forms of psychology, most forms of psychology. It varies depending on the disorder. We also know that we can trace certain brain volumes and brain functions and some branch different forms of psychology. We also know that this is very messy results. Even predicting depression, schizophrenia is very. Nonetheless, this is a central research that I collaborated in my lab. Looking at whether neural responses to the words, getting little things and short amounts of time, might vary between people who are contemplating suicide and people who are not contemplating suicide. There are people studying whether neural reactions to the desire to escape pain might differ. And I bring this up because I goes to show that, again, these studies haven't been written yet, so we're just starting them out now. But the best way forward is to use neural systems that we know a lot about to see whether there's kind of a hallmark difference in the people who are likely to attend. If you're wondering about kind of speed up earlier, like genetics, that I also think really great solid research that came about. And we also in clinical science are usually staying very strong on a diagnosis stress level. So someone might have a weakness or genetic weakness towards a certain issue and never develop that issue unless there's a certain stress event. Likewise, you can especially if you're not develop a certain condition that you have the weakness in your person. So it always seems that's an excellent question. So the question is, is there a potential connection between cognitive distancing and the people who are self-harming and how that relates to the previous question about dissociation? So this is an idea I haven't had. I think it's an excellent insight and something that we should think a lot more about. But the tradition is that the people on the platform are not dissociating as they're writing. But it is possible that something that underlies the experience of self-harm and dissociation is this immediate transformation. What's interesting is that for some people who might actually help you bring yourself into their now space, there's kind of so this is another excellent question. And just so you know why we so that people don't know what you're saying. So the question is about, but what about actually approaching things that are really negative? Can that also help you feel better? This is an excellent question, and something that is a real puzzle for you to understand. We know that one of the most effective ways to help people with anxiety is to get them to approach the things that are really negative. We know that something that really predicts negative psychological outcomes is experiential avoidance, your desire to never feel that things that is away from you. So why is it the case that when people change their life towards more distant, they actually feel better? Similarly, people with depression seem to always be nervous, and people with anxiety seem to always be nervous. So why are we telling them to move away from it? So my thoughts on this are, I think there might be a difference between how your prefrontal cortex cognitive mind deals with situations versus how your more kind of lower level mind needs to learn. So somebody's really afraid of the spider. The best treatment is not to get their is to teach their lower brain that spiders aren't expecting us to. That learning has nothing to do with running away from the spider, it has everything to do with being very close to the spider. So phobias and things like that that are enmeshed in the lower level of the brain that are not so wrapped up in cognitive representation actually might be better treated by a coach rather than by getting things close rather than by that's my thought on that. My thought on the people who are passing all this in the past, I thought there is that they aren't actually always in the past. It's like they're bringing the past into the present, or they're bringing the future into the present. And these things seem really distressing if they are very close in there. What we need these people to realize is that in that but this thing that we think is happening right now, we're losing it on right now, that's not happening. That's something that these people have seen that those things are happening.
One more question.
This is another excellent question. So if I'm sitting with my patients, is it helpful for me to ask them to rephrase what they're saying using more distinct language for that? I want to say yes, and I have a little bit of evidence to that. So one of the studies that has been done asked people to prepare for a very stressful situation. And half of the people were supposed to prepare for it using the word I'm going to go out there, I'm going to say these things, I'm going to be great. The other half of the people were told to just use their name. Eric's going to go out there, Eric's going to say this, Eric's going to do great. And the second group got a lot less anxious, and we did a lot better. So there's a real behavioral consequence to shifting their language. Likewise, we know that shifting their language means that so for both of these reasons, I would say that therapists either instructing them to change their language, let's say this again in a more distinct way, or modeling distinct language. Oh, so it seems you may have been feeling rather than, oh, you are feeling. Both of these things have